A young gunslinger named Vance Crowder laughed loudly as he yanked the reins of an old cowboy's horse, thinking it was nothing more than a joke. He didn't care how the animal trembled or how the old cowboy, Reed Mason, stood still with quiet pain in his eyes. Vance believed he owned the street, believed fear followed him, believed no one would ever question him. But as the dust settled, something in Reed's silence shifted the air around them. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of calm that comes before a storm no one sees coming. Vance felt it too, even if he pretended not to. He didn't know Reed's story. He didn't know dust. Fire wasn't just a horse, but a partner forged through battles and loss. And he didn't know he had just challenged the one pair in the West that never backed away and never forgave cruelty. In the heart of a forgotten frontier town, Reed Mason arrived with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who had survived storms most people never lived to speak about, and he carried that weight in every step he took. The sun beat down on the wooden streets, yet Reed's shadow felt colder than the wind, slipping through the broken saloon doors, pulling quiet attention from anyone who dared look long enough. His coat was worn, his boots were tired, and his eyes held stories heavier than the desert sky. Beside him walked Dustfire, the only soul who had stayed with him through every loss, every night of gunfire, and every dawn of regret, their bond stronger than the steel holsters brushing Reed's side. No one knew why he had returned or why his silence felt so sharp, but every heartbeat in that town sensed that Reed Mason wasn't just passing through. He was walking towards something he could no longer avoid. Reed Mason kept moving down the sunburned street with Dustfire close beside him, and every small sound in that quiet town seemed to stretch longer than it should, as if the world itself sensed something shifting beneath the surface. Reed's gaze stayed steady, but inside him old memories pressed against the walls of his mind. Nights when he held Dustfire's reins with shaking hands, mornings when he buried people he once trusted, and years when silence became the only voice he understood. He had returned to this place because fate had a way of circling back, dragging the past behind it like a long shadow, and as he reached the center of town, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The young gunslinger, Vance Crowder, leaned against a post with a smirk carved across his face, the kind of grin that belonged to someone who believed the world bent for him. Dustfire stopped first, muscles tightening beneath his coat, and Reed felt that familiar tension through the reins like a pulse warning him that something dangerous had already taken root. Vance pushed off the post and walked forward with a loose confidence that didn't match the chill in Reed's heartbeat. Townsfolk watched from windows and doorways, holding their breath because they had seen small sparks grow into wildfire before, and they knew the smallest gesture could set two men on a path no one could step between. Reed didn't say a word as Vance circled Dustfire with slow, mocking steps, eyes shining with a cruel thrill that came from being too young to understand consequences. He flicked a small stone at Dustfire's hooves, not hard enough to injure him, but sharp enough to insult, sharp enough to provoke a reaction he thought would amuse him. Dustfire shifted uneasily, and Reed gently laid a hand on the horse's neck, grounding him with a quiet strength that came from years of trust. Vance laughed and asked why a man as worn as Reed would cling to an animal clearly past its prime, but Reed still offered nothing in return, not even a glance, and that silence made the tension rise like heat off the desert floor. Vance despised being ignored more than anything, and when he stepped closer, Dustfire's ears pinned back, that instinctive signal Reed had learned to read long before words ever mattered. The street felt like it shrank and stretched at the same time, crushing the air yet pulling every eye toward the center where the old cowboy and the arrogant newcomer faced each other without raising their voices or their weapons. Reed knew the anger building inside Vance wasn't bravery. It was insecurity clawing for attention, the same kind that destroyed men long before bullets did, and Dustfire sensed it too with a clarity no human could match. Reed finally lifted his eyes to meet Vance's, and the young gunslinger froze for a heartbeat because the calm in those eyes didn't match the situation. It was too steady, too controlled, too ready. Reed spoke only 3 quiet words telling Vance to step away from Dustfire, and those words, soft yet heavy, struck harder than any threat Vance had ever heard. Something cold crawled under Vance's skin, but pride shoved fear aside and made him laugh again, louder this time, the sound echoing off the empty storefronts like a challenge no one wanted to hear. He reached toward Dustfire's bridle with a careless hand, and the horse jerked back with a sharp snort that signaled the last line being crossed. Reed tightened his grip on the reins, his expression unchanged, but inside him memories rose like smoke. The day Dustfire saved him from an ambush, the night they escaped a burning ranch together, the countless times the horse had stood between him and death without hesitation. Reed knew loyalty like that was sacred in a world built on broken promises, and watching Vance mock that bond pulled something old and fierce awake inside him. The townspeople sensed it too. Whispers died, footsteps halted, and even the wind seemed afraid to move, as if the entire street had bowed its head before a storm that wasn't thunder but something far more human and dangerous. Reed stepped forward just enough to place himself between Vance and Dustfire, and the gunslinger's grin flickered, unsure now, because he expected anger but saw something worse, resolve, cold, unshakable. Vance tried to hide his hesitation, fingers brushing the handle of his revolver out of habit rather than courage, but Reed's voice cut through the moment again, low and steady, telling him he didn't understand what he was provoking. But Vance, blinded by ego, took Reed's calm as weakness, and that single misunderstanding sealed the air around them with a final, trembling stillness, marking the beginning of a confrontation that would burn itself into every soul watching. Reed's steady words hung in the heated air, and Vance felt something inside him tighten, yet pride kept him rooted as he tried to ignore the uneasy prickle running down his spine while Dustfire lowered his head with a slow, deliberate motion that made the street fall even quieter. Reed watched every shift in Vance's stance, reading the restless twitch in the young man's fingers, sensing the unstable mixture of arrogance and fear twisting through him, and Reed knew this moment could still be saved if the man understood the weight of what he was doing. Dustfire stepped sideways, hooves scraping lightly against the dry ground, and that faint sound seemed to echo through every wooden wall around them, as if the whole town was listening through its bones. Vance tried to hide the tremor in his voice as he told Reed that no old cowboy would ever make him move, no matter how calm he pretended to be. But Reed saw right through the bravado to the uncertainty beneath it. The wind brushed past, carrying specks of dust across the street, and Reed felt the shift in Dustfire's muscles as the horse sensed the rising storm inside Vance, a storm made not of courage but of swelling ego desperate to assert itself. Reed placed a gentle hand on Dustfire's neck to steady him, the quiet gesture revealing a bond built on years of trust and shared hardship, and the sight of that connection only irritated Vance more, because it reminded him of everything he lacked: discipline, purpose, and something worth standing beside. Vance stepped closer with a forced smirk stretching across his face, the kind that tried to hide frustration beneath thin confidence, and Reed kept his gaze firm, knowing one careless movement could ignite a reaction that no one could reverse once set in motion. A few townspeople retreated deeper into the shadows of their doorways, unsure whether they were witnessing a simple standoff or the start of a confrontation that could stain the street with regret. And the tension thickened with every breath drawn between the two men. Dustfire's ears flicked forward, picking up the uneven rhythm of Vance's breathing, and Reed recognized the signal immediately because the horse had always sensed danger before any human eye could catch it, and Reed whispered a soft word meant only for Dustfire, grounding him through a calm that had carried them through countless perilous nights. Vance let his hand hover near his belt, not quite touching the holster, but close enough to announce his growing impatience. Yet Reed didn't raise his voice, didn't change his stance, didn't let fear control even a single heartbeat. Instead, he took a single step forward, not threateningly, but with an authority that came from a lifetime of surviving moments just like this. Moments where silence guarded a man better than any weapon ever could. Vance's jaw tightened, and Reed saw the battle raging in his eyes, one side pleading for him to step back before he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, the other telling him to keep pushing, because pride insisted he must never retreat. The air felt heavy, as if time itself hesitated, unsure whether to move forward or hold everything still, and Dustfire shifted again, responding to the rising energy pulsing between Reed and Vance. Reed finally spoke, his voice low but unmistakably firm, telling Vance that Dustfire had done nothing to deserve cruelty, and that mocking loyalty revealed more about the man who mocked than the animal he targeted. Those words struck deeper than Reed intended, and Vance's expression cracked for a brief moment, revealing something raw: resentment, loneliness, and a desperate desire to be seen as powerful, even though he felt anything but. The brief vulnerability flickered out as soon as it appeared, swallowed by a sharper glare as Vance stepped closer, and the street's stillness tightened, pulling every pair of eyes toward them like a magnet. Dustfire snorted softly, muscles rippling beneath his coat in a way Reed understood instantly, a silent warning from a partner who had stood beside him through ambushes, betrayals, and long nights carved by fear. Reed knew the horse wasn't scared. He was preparing, reading Vance with the same instinctive accuracy he always had, and Reed placed his palm gently on Dustfire's shoulder to keep him grounded. Vance noticed the silent communication between man and animal, and jealousy stirred inside him because he had never formed any bond strong enough to rely on, never trusted anything long enough to let it matter. That jealousy hardened into frustration, and frustration twisted into reckless defiance as he took another bold step, his boots crunching against the dry earth with a sound sharp enough to cut through the wind. Reed's eyes never left him, calm yet unyielding, and that unwavering steadiness made Vance's pulse stumble, because he realized Reed wasn't intimidated, wasn't impressed, wasn't even irritated. He was simply ready, prepared for whatever came next with a patience Vance could not comprehend. The young gunslinger's breath quickened, his pride battling his growing hesitation, and Dustfire lifted his head higher, mirroring Reed's quiet vigilance. In that moment, the town seemed to shrink around them, pulling the edges of every building inward, framing the confrontation as if the world understood something monumental was about to unfold. Reed didn't move again, didn't shift or flinch, but his presence alone pushed against Vance with a force that felt heavier than any threat spoken aloud, and for a heartbeat Vance wondered if he had stepped into something far beyond his understanding. Yet pride, stubborn and blind, refused to let him retreat, and as the silence deepened, Reed saw clearly that the moment of choice had arrived, a point from which the story of this day would carve itself into memory, whether either man wanted it or not. Reed watched the final flicker of hesitation vanish from Vance's eyes, and the young gunslinger pushed forward with a stubborn determination that carried more recklessness than courage, while Dustfire lifted his head in a sharp, alert motion that revealed he had already judged the man in front of them as a threat. Reed felt the horse's rising tension through the reins, a silent message formed from years of shared battles, and he tightened his grip just enough to steady him without holding him back, because he trusted Dustfire's instincts even more than his own. Vance's jaw clenched as he tried to mask his growing unease behind a smirk, yet the tremor in his fingers betrayed him, and Reed noticed it instantly, knowing that fear layered beneath false confidence often created the most dangerous kind of man. The street held its breath as Vance circled, slow at first, then faster, trying to find an angle from which he could establish control, but every motion he made only deepened the bond on display between Reed and Dustfire, a connection he couldn't understand and didn't know how to challenge. Dustfire shifted his weight with deliberate precision, hooves pressing into the ground in a controlled rhythm as if he were measuring Vance's next move before it happened, and Reed whispered a quiet command meant only for the horse, a sound so soft no one else could hear, yet Dustfire responded as if the words carried the strength of a lifetime. Vance saw that silent communication, and something inside him twisted with resentment, a dark and desperate realization that he had spent his life trying to command fear rather than earn loyalty, and he hated how effortlessly Reed stood there, calm, anchored, and connected to an animal that trusted him without question. The frustration pushed Vance toward a reckless step, one that brought him too close too quickly, and Dustfire swung his head with a smooth but warning motion that stopped the gunslinger mid-breath. Reed didn't raise his voice or his hand. He simply held Vance's gaze with a steady calm that stripped away any illusion of dominance the young man had tried to build, and Vance felt the weight of that quiet authority press against him like an invisible force. The townspeople sensed something ancient in that stare, something forged from years of loss, sacrifice, and battles won only because Reed and Dustfire stood as a single unit, and the atmosphere thickened with a tension that felt almost alive. Vance swallowed hard but refused to retreat, driven by a stubborn flame inside him that burned too fast and too bright, a flame fueled by years of trying to prove he was stronger than the fear he carried. Reed recognized that look because he had once seen it in men who believed pride could shield them from the consequences of their choices, and he understood that Vance wasn't fighting Reed, he was fighting the ghosts of his own failures. But Dustfire didn't see ghosts, he saw motion, energy, intent. When Vance shifted his stance again, dust rising around his boots, Dustfire responded instantly with a subtle but powerful repositioning, placing himself at Reed's side with a readiness that made every spectator lean forward in silent awe. Reed felt the moment building like pressure before a breaking storm, yet he stayed grounded, trusting the years carved into his bones, trusting Dustfire's judgment, trusting the unspoken language that linked them tighter than any command ever could. Vance took another step, quick, aggressive, and Dustfire answered with a sharp exhale that vibrated through the ground, a warning that pulsed through the air like the low growl of a predator guarding its own. Reed's voice finally broke the silence, low and controlled, telling Vance that stepping closer meant crossing the final line. and the raw sincerity in his tone forced Vance to pause, because there was no threat in those words, only truth. But pride drowned out reason, pushing Vance into one last bold movement, and Dustfire reacted before Reed even shifted, lowering his body slightly as if bracing for what he sensed would come next. Reed saw it all unfold in the span of a breath, the stubborn fire in Vance, the rising fury in the air, and the fierce loyalty in Dustfire's stance, and he realized that the secret people whispered about him wasn't a legend at all. It was the unshakable partnership between man and horse, a bond honed through survival and sharpened by loss, a bond Vance had fatally underestimated the moment he chose to provoke it. Vance's final step landed with a force that sent a thin tremor through the ground, and in that exact heartbeat Dustfire moved, not wildly but with a precision that seemed almost unreal, shifting his weight and swinging his powerful body between Reed and the gunslinger, with a fluid, instinctive protectiveness that froze the entire street in stunned silence. Reed didn't pull the reins or issue any sharp command. He simply allowed Dustfire to act, trusting him the same way he always had, and that quiet trust shaped the moment more than any weapon could. Vance stumbled back a half step, startled by the sudden closeness of the horse's massive frame, and his breath caught in his throat as Dustfire lowered his head with a warning tension that no one dared misread. The townspeople leaned forward with held breath, watching a scene that felt larger than life, as if the fate of that dusty street depended on the next few seconds. Reed stepped to Dustfire's side, his calm presence anchoring the horse, yet his eyes never left Vance, reading the young man's panic beneath the thin shell of pride. Vance tried to recover, adjusting his stance as if he could somehow regain control, but Dustfire responded to even that slight motion with a subtle yet unmistakable shift that pushed the air tighter around them. Reed spoke softly, telling Vance to lower his hand and step back before he pushed himself into a situation he wasn't prepared to face. But Vance's pride, bruised and burning, refused to yield. His fingers hovered near his belt out of pure reflex, not intention, yet Dustfire reacted the moment that motion flickered through the air, his hooves scraping against the dirt in a sharp, decisive movement that made Vance flinch. The sound echoed through the street, bouncing off wooden walls and rattling loose shutters, and that single scrape felt louder than a thunderclap. Reed moved closer, placing a hand on Dustfire's shoulder, guiding him without force, and the horse's breathing steadied as he stayed locked on Vance with an intensity that made the gunslinger's bravado crumble even faster. Vance's throat tightened, his heartbeat loud enough in his chest to drown his thoughts, and he felt a cold realization wash through him. The old cowboy hadn't needed to lift a weapon, hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to posture or boast. His strength came from the loyalty standing beside him, a loyalty earned through years of surviving together, a loyalty Vance had never experienced in his life. The truth struck him with a weight he couldn't ignore. Reed wasn't dangerous because he was skilled, though he clearly was. He wasn't feared because of his reputation, though whispers of it lingered in every saloon from one border to the next. He was dangerous because he wasn't alone. Vance took another hesitant step back, but his shifting boots sent another cloud of dust swirling into the air, and Dustfire reacted with a sudden, powerful lunge forward, not to harm, but to force distance before the moment spiraled into something neither man could undo. The horse's movement knocked Vance off balance, sending him stumbling and falling to his knees, the shock of the impact knocking the wind from his chest. Gasps rose from the watching crowd, but Reed didn't smirk, didn't taunt, didn't take advantage of the young man's vulnerability. He simply tightened his grip on Dustfire's reins and stepped forward with the steady presence of someone who had seen too many lives ruined by reckless pride. Vance trembled, dust clinging to his clothes as he stared up at Reed, the weight of his own choices pressing on him harder than the fall had. Dustfire stopped just inches away, towering over him with a strength that didn't need explanation, and Vance finally understood the truth he had been too blind to see. Reed Mason wasn't dangerous because he fought battles. He was dangerous because he survived them with Dustfire at his side. The pair didn't move like man and animal. They moved like a single force bound by trust deeper than fear, deeper than rage, deeper than any challenge a prideful gunslinger could throw at them. And as Vance knelt there, breath shaking, pride shattered, the street knew the storm had already passed, leaving behind a single lesson carved deep into the dust. No one challenged Reed Mason and Dustfire without learning the true meaning of loyalty and consequence. Reed stood over Vance with a stillness that felt heavier than any threat, and Dustfire's breath moved in slow, deep waves as the horse kept his stance firm, waiting for Reed's signal even though none was needed because the message had already settled into the dust around them. Vance didn't try to rise. He couldn't, not with the pressure of his own fear pinning him down and the realization sinking deeper with every heartbeat that the moment wasn't about strength or dominance but about facing the truth he had run from his entire life. Reed stepped closer, not aggressively, but with a calm authority that made Vance's pulse stumble, and when Reed spoke, his voice carried a quiet force that echoed through the street more powerfully than any shout. He told Vance that cruelty was the easiest choice a man could make, that mocking another's companion revealed emptiness, not confidence, and that people who built their lives on fear always crumbled when faced with someone who built theirs on loyalty. Dustfire lowered his head slightly as Reed spoke, as if he understood every word, and Vance's eyes locked on the horse's calm, steady gaze, realizing with a sinking heaviness that the bond between them wasn't something formed through commands or dominance, but through trust earned in moments far harsher than this one. Reed crouched slightly, not threatening, just enough to meet Vance's eyes at level ground, and he told the young man that arrogance had a way of blinding even the strongest, turning them into their own worst enemy, and that today could be the day Vance either kept falling into that darkness or finally stopped running from the emptiness inside him. Vance's throat tightened, and he tried to form words, but nothing escaped. All he could do was watch Reed's steady expression, his calm breathing, and the quiet strength in every movement Dustfire made beside him. The wind swept across the street, pulling loose dust into gentle spirals, and the silence that followed Reed's words felt like a mirror held in front of Vance's trembling pride. Reed told him that being feared didn't make a man powerful. It made him lonely, and loneliness pushed men into choices they regretted long after the dust settled. Dustfire nudged Reed's shoulder with a soft, grounding motion, and Reed placed a hand on the horse's neck without looking away from Vance, reminding him that a bond like this wasn't built overnight, wasn't bought, wasn't forced. It was earned through patience, sacrifice, and honesty, three things Vance had avoided for too long. The crowd watched in absolute stillness, waiting for anger or violence, but none came, because Reed wasn't there to humiliate the young man. He was there to teach him, even if the lesson came wrapped in a moment Vance would remember for the rest of his life. Reed told him he didn't want to break him, didn't want to shame him, and didn't want to turn this into a story of revenge, but he also wouldn't allow anyone to lay a cruel hand on Dustfire again. Vance nodded slowly, barely able to breathe, the weight of guilt pressing against his ribs as he realized he had crossed a line without understanding its depth. Reed rose to his feet with calm dignity, Dustfire stepping back in perfect harmony with him, and the movement held more grace and power than any display of force ever could. Vance finally pushed himself upright, shaky and breathless, and Reed told him that walking away didn't make him weak, it made him wiser than he had been moments ago. The words struck him harder than any blow could have. Vance lowered his gaze, struggling to swallow the lump in his throat, and Reed finished with a quiet reminder that respect was something a man earned through actions, not threats. Dustfire let out a soft exhale, the tension draining from his stance, and for the first time Vance saw not a beast trained for conflict, but a partner who carried half of Reed's soul in his steady heartbeat. As Reed turned away, guiding Dustfire with him, the street felt lighter, as if the very air understood that something had shifted inside the young gunslinger, something that might not erase his past, but could finally change his direction. Reed walked forward with Dustfire beside him, leaving Vance standing in the settling dust, and the quiet that followed felt like the whole town was holding its breath as a fading echo of something unforgettable lingered in the air. Vance watched the pair move toward the horizon, understanding with aching clarity that he had witnessed a kind of strength that didn't come from guns or swagger, but from a bond deeper than fear, deeper than pride, deeper than any legend he had ever heard whispered in lonely saloons. Dustfire's steady steps matched Reed's heartbeat, and the two moved as if the world itself parted for them, carrying the weight of old scars with the grace of men who no longer feared them. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the empty street, Vance realized he hadn't just survived a confrontation. He had been given a chance to become someone better, and Reed Mason's silent mercy would follow him longer than any gunshot ever could.